Hi everyone. This is going to be our last lecture for week 13. We're going to be talking about pathogens and infections of the nervous system. The central nervous system will include the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system will include the nerves and also some of the neuromuscular junctions where nerve cells meet muscles. So we'll begin with an overview of the nervous system and then move on to the pathogens. You can find the reading information in chapter 26 and then a little bit in chapter 23 because tetanus is included in the wound infections chapter. However, because there's a nervous system toxin in the tetanus toxin, I've decided to include this pathogen in our nervous system lecture. So read the parts of the chapters that relate to these four pathogens, as well as the introductory part of each chapter, which would be the anatomy and defenses of the nervous system. So that would be chapter 26.1, I believe. Let's begin with that. The nervous system is composed of two major parts. The central nervous system, or CNS for short, consists of the brain and the spinal cord and the membrane layers that surround those brain and spinal cord. The neurons are the nerve cells within the nervous system. So a neuron consists of a cell body, which has the nucleus, the dendrites, which are the receiving end of neurotransmitter signals, and then the axons, which are the transmitting end of the nervous system. So a nerve signal is received from the dendrites and it's transmitted through the axon. And this neurotransmitter signal can go through a synaptic space, or the space between one neuron and another neuron, or it can be, if it's in the peripheral nervous system, it might be a cell in the body, like a muscle cell. I spelled muscle wrong. Okay. So neurons are the cells of the nervous system. The meninges are the membrane layers around the brain and spinal cord. So these serve to protect the brain and spinal cord and keep the cerebral spinal fluid within to help cushion and protect. The peripheral nervous system refers to the nerves, which are bundles of axons. So in our brain and spinal cord, we have our cell bodies and dendrites. And then what nerves are clusters of axons that travel together to affect various cells or tissues or parts of the body. So a lot of peripheral nervous system infections will affect the neuromuscular joints or the periphery of the body. We've in fact already seen one when we talked about shingles staying latent in the peripheral nerve endings in the skin. Okay, so when we describe diseases, we can describe an infection as either a central nervous infection or a peripheral nervous system infection. Those will be the two major categories of infections. More on the microbiology of the nervous system. Microbes can get in. It's very difficult for microbes to get in, but if they do, they usually enter through the nasopharynx, which is the back of the nose/mouth. So right where the back of your throat meets the back of your nasal cavity, that would be your nasopharynx. Microbes can pass through the tissues of the nasopharynx into the bloodstream. They may or may not be able to cross that blood-brain barrier and get into the brain or into the meninges and then travel through the cerebral spinal fluid also to the spinal cord. So the nasopharynx is usually the portal of entry, or the sinuses. The sinuses are actually air pockets in our skull, and so if a microbe can get from the sinuses into the nervous system, that'd be another way to get it. All right. Though because of the bone and the reduced permeability of the blood vessels, This rarely happens, that microbes can get in there. And that reduced permeability of the blood vessels is called the blood-brain barrier. So the nervous system often doesn't have a lot of white blood cells circulating. It's very low on blood cells and antimicrobial peptides. The blood-brain, but it's very hard for microbes to get in. So that would be a first-line defense. The cerebral spinal fluid provides cushion and protection and an extra layer of a barrier between the brain and spinal cord and the bloodstream. And then the blood-brain barrier refers to the lowered or reduced permeability of the blood vessels that enter the brain. So usually the only thing that will go through those blood vessels will be glucose and oxygen, and that is it. And that's what the brain needs. Right. And there should be no microbiome of the nervous system. The brain, the spinal cord, the meninges, and the cerebral spinal fluid should all be microbe-free. So the nervous system should be a sterile system overall. All right. So the first pathogen that we're going to talk about, the first two pathogens are going to be species within the family Clostridium. The first one is Clostridium botulinum. That'd be the name of the pathogen, item number 1. The disease that it causes is botulism. So botulinum causes botulism, and it is a gram-positive bacterium. What botulism is a muscle paralysis caused by a toxin that inhibits the transmission of a nerve signals or neurotransmitter signal to the muscles. So it inhibits those neuromuscular junctions. And so if there's no signal to the muscles, then there's no contraction. So no contraction is what paralysis means. So this would be a peripheral nervous system infection, which could be the disease description. Peripheral nervous infection that causes muscle paralysis. So that would be our disease description. All right. It is a species of Clostridium, so it forms endospores. So yes to endospores. It's gram-positive, not gram-negative, so will not form lipopolysaccharide. It is also not a capsule-forming bacterium. So of the 3 major virulence factors, endospores is the only one. That's a yes. As far as additional information, the major virulence factor is this botulinum toxin. I've already mentioned how it works, but if you look at the letters, botulinum toxin, Bo, toxin, tox, this is also known as Botox. So if you get a Botox injection in a localized area, like the skin underneath your forehead, those muscles won't contract, and that will help prevent the appearance of wrinkles. So Botox comes from botulinum toxin. It's actually an injection of the toxin into the muscle layer beneath the skin. All right, more facts about botulism. It can be transmitted by ingestion of the endospores or exposure of a wound to Clostridium botulinum endospores or the pathogen, or just the vegetative organism itself. So in order to prevent transmission or getting ingestion of the food, proper food handling. So if you heat foods, the heating of 60, 70, 80 degrees Celsius, even boiling, will damage the toxin. So botulinum toxin is heat labile, or it'll be destroyed by heat. However, that type of heat won't kill endospores. And so this is one reason why you are not supposed to give honey to infants under the age of 1, because you can't sterilize the honey without destroying it. there's always a small chance that the botulinum endospores could be in the honey. So moderate temperatures won't destroy those endospores, only autoclaving or gamma radiation can destroy those endospores. And then also cleaning wounds, preventing them from becoming infected is another way to prevent a Clostridium botulinum infection. Even though it's a bacterium, antibiotics will rarely help with the infection because it won't cause symptoms until after it's already grown and formed the toxin. Once the toxin is formed, antibiotics may kill the bacterium, but it won't get rid of the toxin. So there is an antitoxin therapy which neutralizes the toxin that has been formed by Clostridium botulinum. All right, we're also going to talk about a second species of Clostridium called Clostridium tetani. So the pathogen name is Clostridium tetani. Like other Clostridium species, it's gram-positive, and the disease it causes is in the name. It causes tetanus. So we'll take a closer look at what tetanus actually is. Before we get that, a little bit about Clostridium. It's a bacillus, which, just to review, bacilli are rod-shaped, and it is an endospore former like most species of Clostridium. So that means if you look at it under the microscope, you might see an endospore at one end of the cell. And remember, if you do an endospore stain, those endospores will appear green against a red cell background. All right, so more on tetanus. Tetanus is commonly called lockjaw. It's not quite it's a paralysis, but it's a paralysis that's actually caused by uncontrollable muscle contraction. So a constant muscle contraction that causes the muscles to lock up. So because it infects the neuromuscular joints, it's also going to be an infection of the peripheral nervous system. And the major result is uncontrollable muscle contraction. So that would be the disease description. It does form endospores, but because it's not gram-negative, it won't form lipopolysaccharide, and it also is not a capsule-forming organism. Additional information about the infection. The jaw locking up is one major symptom. If the back muscles are affected, then extreme arching of the back will occur or flexing of the arms and legs. The most serious symptom will be when the stomach muscles start uncontrollably retracting. This will cause regurgitation of the stomach fluids up out of the stomach into the esophagus, and that can fill up the lungs. If the lungs fill up with this fluid, then that is the most likely cause of death. So a tetanus infection can be very dangerous. The major virulence factor is the toxin that causes this uncontrollable muscle contraction. The toxin is called tetanospasmin. Tetano for tetanus, spasmin for the muscle spasms. This is an exotoxin produced by the Clostridium, and it acts in the central nervous system, but what it does is it blocks the inhibition of the muscle contraction. And so even though the toxin initially has an effect in the central nervous system, it's the peripheral nervous system or those neuromuscular junctions that are inhibited. So if you inhibit the inhibition of muscle contraction, so if you are blocking the inhibition of muscle contraction, then you just have muscle contraction all the time. So inhibiting the inhibition of muscle contraction causes uncontrollable muscle contraction. Transmission of tetanus is through parenteral transmission, which parenteral means implantation through the skin. So it's often a well-known fact that You don't want to step on a rusty nail because you might get tetanus. So the reason the rusty nail is such a good fomite or parenteral object is because it's sharp and pointy, so it can get through the skin. And it's also very dry and dusty and rusty. And many pathogens won't live very long on the surface of a nail, but an endospore former can last for a really long time on these dry, dusty objects. And because endospores confer long-lasting durability, that enables the Clostridium tetani endospores to survive for a very long period of time. All right. More rarely, direct contact with the endospores could cause an infection. Tetanus is one of the most reliable vaccines, or the tetanus vaccination is almost 100% effective. So tetanus is an infection that's a vaccine preventable. Usually the vaccine is not just on its own, but often it's found as DTaP or Tdap, which is a vaccination that combines protection against tetanus with also protection against diphtheria and pertussis. And just like with the Clostridium botulinum, since the effect is through a toxin that's produced after the microbe has grown, antibiotics will be less effective, whereas antitoxin therapy can treat the infection if it's already gotten to the toxin production stage. If you know that you might have gotten a tetanus infection, let's say you've stepped on a rusty nail, antibiotics could be a preventative treatment if it hasn't gotten to that toxin stage. Before the microbes grow and start forming or making the toxin. All right. Our next two infections will be of the central nervous system or the brain and spinal cord. The first pathogen that we're going to talk about of the next two is Neisseria meningitidis. Meningitis refers to the fact that it will cause meningitis. So our pathogen name is Neisseria meningitidis. It is a gram-negative bacterium and it causes bacterial meningitis or meningococcal meningitis. All right, so more on the bacterium. It is gram-negative. So what that means is it has a cell membrane, a very thin cell wall, and it has an outer membrane with porins, lipoproteins, and the little squiggles that come off the surface are called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS for short. The lipid portion of that lipopolysaccharide is what's called endotoxin. So any gram-negative pathogen by default will have endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide in the outer membrane. So that's one of the things of the fifth category you need to know. It also does form capsules. Because it's not Clostridium or bacillus, it does not form endospores. Neisseria meningitidis is a gram-negative diplococcus, and so diplo means pairs, cocci means two, so you see this signature of two cocci cells together. So if you did a gram stain of the cerebral spinal fluid and saw red or pinkish diplococci, then that would be a good indication that the meningitis infection was caused by Neisseria meningitidis, because it's got this very characteristic appearance. All right, so a description of what meningitis is. Meninge refers to the meninges, and itis refers to inflammation. So meningitis is when the meninges are inflamed and infected. So an inflammation of a severe inflammation of the membrane layers surrounding the brain and spinal cord. So again, this is a central nervous system infection. Common symptoms of meningitis include a headache and a very stiff neck, potentially some nausea as well. That's also a sign of neurological inflammation. Some signs will include a very high fever, high white blood cell count or neutrophil count in the cerebrospinal fluid. So in order to diagnose a bacterial meningitis infection, you have to sample the cerebrospinal fluid, or that CSF, that fluid within the meninges layer surrounding the brain and spinal cord. It is not easy, nor is it comfortable to get a sample of your cerebrospinal fluid. It requires a spinal tap, which is a tap into that CSF fluid in order to get some of that fluid out and perform a diagnostic test. The most likely cause of death is when this endotoxin gets into the bloodstream. So if the infection reaches a severe level, that means the cells multiply to the extent where they start shedding their LPS, or their endotoxin, and that endotoxin can cross back into the bloodstream and result in septic shock and coma. Because the septic shock is caused by endotoxin, it's also sometimes called endotoxic shock, and death will often result if infections reach this stage, which is about 50% of the time. So bacterial meningitis can be very, very serious, and it is treatable in some of the initial stages, but it is less likely to be treatable when it reaches this latter stage after the toxins have entered the bloodstream. Transmission of meningitis occurs through respiratory droplets, which come from coughing and sneezing. In the United States, it's often associated with a communal setting where a lot of people are in a close setting, and then there's an sporadic outbreak or an epidemic in that setting. So college dorms are one of the #1 risk factors for bacterial meningitis outbreaks. Despite that, the prevalence of meningitis in the United States is pretty low. So on average, there's about 1 case per year for every 100,000 individuals. And so when we represent the number of cases per 100,000, that represents prevalence in terms of our epidemiological statistics. And that comes up to about a total number of just over 4,000 cases per year in the US and about 500 deaths. The meningitis belt, where meningitis is much more prevalent, is in sub-Saharan Africa between Senegal and Ethiopia and Kenya. In these regions, the prevalence numbers are higher. And so if you're traveling to one of these regions, it's often suggested to get the vaccine. So meningitis is vaccine preventable. It's not always widely administered in the US because of the low prevalence of the infection. However, traveling to a region where it's more prevalent makes it a wise decision to get the vaccine. And again, if you can catch the infection in the early stages with the headache and the stiff neck before the toxin production stage results in death, the infection can be treatable with antibiotics. So penicillin would be an antibiotic that inhibits bacterial cell wall synthesis. And even though many gram-negative bacteria are resistant to penicillin and penicillin derivatives, Neisseria is an example of a gram-negative genus that doesn't have those beta-lactamases or those penicillinases. So penicillin and penicillin derivatives do work against the Neisseria genus. And cephalosporins, if the bacterium is resistant to penicillin or penicillin derivatives. All right, the last pathogen on our list today is Toxoplasma gondii. So Toxoplasma is the name of the pathogen. The microbe type is that it's a protozoan. So this is a microeukaryote. All protozoans are single-celled, and they all lack a cell wall. So that's what makes them different from the single-celled fungi, the yeast. So protozoa lack a cell wall. Just to review protozoa, we had 4 different types that we learned about in Unit 1. We had the amoeba, the ciliates, the flagellates, and the apicomplexa. This particular protozoan is a flagellate. So you don't need to know that, you just need to know that flagellates are one of the 4 types of protozoa. And the host of this pathogen or parasite is a cat or feline host. And these parasites must live inside a host cell, so they are called obligate intracellular parasites. Obligate meaning they must, intracellular meaning they live inside other cells, and parasite refers to the fact that that relationship is parasitic or harms the host cell. The life cycle includes a dormant structure called an oocyst. It's similar to a fungal spore, but it's slightly different in structure. And the oocyst can last for a long time in moist soils or litter box environments. The disease that is caused by Toxoplasma is a subacute, which can be anywhere from mild to severe, encephalitis. So encephalitis means an inflammation of the brain. We also call this toxoplasmosis. So toxoplasmosis would be the name of the infection. Encephalitis or brain inflammation, mild to severe, would be the description. Because the host is a cat and because you can get a toxoplasmosis infection from a cat, it's considered a zoonotic disease or a zoonosis, meaning that it is transmitted from an animal host. Most adults don't experience any symptoms at all and don't even know that they have an infection. In fact, it's been posited that up to 1/3 of the population has already been exposed and has the infection. What happens is if the infection crosses the placental barrier and infects a fetus, and if the mother doesn't have antibodies already to the infection, so if it's a new exposure that occurred during pregnancy, then the effect on the fetus can be fatal or if not just very severe. So the infection can be severe in fetuses and also those that are immunocompromised or have an immunodeficiency. It is transmitted from cats through those oocysts that can be found in moist soils or in litter boxes. So avoiding contact with litter boxes or cat poop is one way to prevent the infection. These oocysts can also get into meat products, and so the ingestion of undercooked meat, if you eat undercooked meat, you could also ingest those oocysts, and they could germinate into the flagellate form. So avoiding contact, cooking meat thoroughly all the way through, no pink center, these would be the major ways to prevent toxoplasmosis infection. If you have a toxoplasmosis infection, antibiotics usually aren't given, but it can be treated if necessary. So antimicrobials that are effective against protozoa I don't have a list of them. Just know that regular bacterial antibiotics won't be effective against protozoa. There are antimicrobials that can inhibit protozoa, and so these would be administered if an individual is in a high-risk group, if they are immunocompromised, or if they are pregnant. That's it for nervous system pathogens, and that's it for the end of our week 13 lectures. Thank you.